So I wanted to talk about institutional resilience in crisis. Because often in crisis, the secret, I think, often to do with crisis is understanding that people can't see what maintains stability until it ceases to do so, and understand that most crises are actually just telling you lots of things that you need to know. It's giving you all the information you need just a bit late. But I wanted to talk about stability and institutional resilience, because Brexit and the other crisis that we're in, I mean, we're about to go through a massive change, and to put it bluntly, we're about to go through a considerable loss of prestige in this country. Now, the problem that we have is that elite cultures are protecting an identity and flapping about and just getting increasingly fucking annoying and toxic, but stupid, utterly stupid, as they try to hide from this. But in actual fact, even though, like, I'm discussing a complete decimation of the rule of law, in the last 8 years, the rule of law for women and children around safeguarding and domestic abuse has been completely undermined. And that should feel like the end of the world. And certainly there have been times in the last 8 years where it was like, can you just roll equality back for women like that? No, you can't. Not at all. So, I talk about local authority reform, and I talk about universal credit, and they're in system failure, they're in actual system failure, but you can't tell they're in system failure, because they don't break down. And what you have to understand for this is that actually system failure here is measured by whether the rule of law is undermined, and whether systems are becoming harmful and meeting their objectives and being prevented from doing that. Because in actual fact, they're still running incredibly reliably, day in, day out, millions and millions and millions and millions of transactions. And I'm reminded of once in Todd Job Centre, I forgot to back up the data for a week. I lost a week's Job Centre data because there was a problem and they needed the backup that I hadn't made. And that problem chased me for months and months and months, because in that week there were thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions. Universal credit systems are using infrastructure and computer frameworks that actually the processing of payments is incredibly reliable. And so it's often tempting in a crisis to focus on what's damaged and that's really important, but actually what's quite as important is keeping an eye on what's still working. Now, the UK is a very, very stable country. We've just come out of a 70-odd year period of stability. Not being funny, you don't get that kind of stability if you're grossly unequal. The first time I ever heard that the rule of law didn't apply to me was in 2010, and all that's really happened is the institutions who told me that are now in crisis because of it. That rule of law is not damaged. The institutions that deliver it are not damaged, but they're still functioning, and the people that uphold that rule of law are still going to do so. And there is considerable institutional resilience. And so, one of the things that had happened with grooming was I'd actually kind of reconciled myself to the fact that actually this was erosion of systems, and this had happened, and this terrible thing that I had been part of, had occurred. And, I personally, on a personal level, I've had, I'm only really getting to the point where I can reconcile myself with some of that stuff now. But actually also what happened was a level of institutional resilience. It became a crisis. There was a political response. It's part of a wider crisis. And it often doesn't feel like this when you're in the middle of it. Self-ID feels like the end of the world. Sometimes, some of the consequences that women have had to deal with as a matter of, because they've made themselves visible during this debate, are horrific. Women shouldn't be afraid. Women shouldn't be fighting for their jobs because they said this is the rule of law. And because the noise has been so terrifying sometimes, it's really important to remember that what's actually happened is a group of activists have tried to threaten a rule of law, and all that's happened is it's generated crisis, which have exposed structural weaknesses in all our institutions, but have also exposed incredible institutional resilience. And yesterday, I met somebody from Occupy yesterday, and we were talking about how scary it was to sleep in a tent outside St Paul's Cathedral, which it bloody was. But we were sat in that room in this functioning institution, this institution that's, I understand the history of this institution and the institutions it's connected to, and you have to understand 2,000 years of history. And the fact is, in 2018, women can stand up for their rights and end up in the House of Lords. and be heard. And there's a considerable amount of institutional resilience. And, you know, a considerable power dynamics have been exposed between women, considerable tensions between institutions have also been exposed. But this is actually healthy. It can feel complicated in the middle, it can feel noisy, but these periods are actually incredibly useful. And what this period has actually shown is that actually what women are fighting for in this country is not revolution, but the rule of law. And our participation is waking up these political processes and strengthening them. You know, and where we were at yesterday was an institution that's hundreds and hundreds of years old that is essentially, well, it might be full of snakes and, you know, people with the morals of rattlesnakes. It's actually an institution which functions quite well to uphold our right to say no. And I think it's worth paying attention to the extent of the institutional resilience that have been on display during this crisis, and knowing that that's actually ours as we go through a bigger crisis. And I think it's probably worth doing that as we kind of move forward and things get a bit more unstable in the country.